I forgot to mention in my video for yesterday's section of this hike that the camp where I stayed this night, aside from being an orchard for apples and pears of a lot of different varieties, also had this enormous blackberry bramble growing up the side of the storage barn next to where I had set up my tent. So for the entire afternoon, while I had all of my gear laying out in the sun to dry, and all in the morning when I was making my breakfast and packing up to go, I was eating as many blackberries as I could. It was really nice. But in any case, I have set out now. This is about an hour, maybe half an hour after I've left camp, and I'm walking through a number of cornfields. But when I get to the end of this windbreak on my left here, you'll see out in the field, you can almost see the sea off in the distance just past the shoreline. I suppose I don't need to keep bringing that up, but it is something that along my hike I keep noticing, and it keeps striking me just how different the landscape here feels. The wide open expanse of sky and field is a very different experience from hiking through mountains or even just hiking through a forest. It's so much more expansive. I feel like I'm in such a much more wide open space. I should also mention that what you see me turning to my right here to look at is a small post that has a trailblaze painted on it. I come across these every now and then along the trail, but they're always a rare sort of surprise. It's like somebody has hidden them away for me to find. One last thing before I turn behind this tree break again. You can see off in the distance, past the fields, there is a line of forest that cuts across on the way to the coast. I'll be jogging around that in about 1 kilometer and following a small trail around some lakes and some marshland before making my way onto a road that approaches the town of Silmenitz. That's the last small village along the coast before I turn westward for my last segment of trail. You can see as I'm approaching Silmenitz here, there's a large bay behind the village. That's the Schoritzer Wiek. The word Wiek, by the way, is a loan word from Old Scandinavian for a bay or a cove. So a lot of the inlets and bays around the island of Rügen are named a Wiek. I'll be making my way around the Schoritzer Wiek later in the day. There's a campground on the opposite side of it where I'm going to be setting up my tent for the night. One other thing that I should probably mention here, since I think this is going to be one of the only times in this hike where you'll be able to see footage of me approaching a small village with houses, is that the architecture here is also quite different. You'll maybe notice that some of the houses here have thatched roofs, and that's a common feature of a lot of the farmhouses that are around the island of Rügen. There are also a lot of different cultural influences on the architecture here. Rügen, as an island on the Baltic Sea, was strategically important, and so was settled and resettled by lots of different groups over the centuries. There's some Slavic influence, some Baltic influence, some Scandinavian influence, like, for example, in the name used for bays, calling them a Wiek. And you'll see a few linguistic remnants of some of the other cultures around the island as well. This is, I think, one of the things about hiking along the e-paths that makes them so fascinating for me. It's a very different experience from, for example, hiking along the long-distance trails in the United States. The cultural landscape in Europe is obviously a lot more heterogeneous, and so if I do continue following this trail southward, I'm already approaching south of Berlin, a section of trail that passes around Cottbus, where there is a native Slavic-speaking German diaspora population that speaks its own Slavic language, Sorbian. And of course, once I get into Czechia, I will have to either find somebody who can speak Czech, or I'll have to learn it myself if I want to make my way through some of the smaller towns and villages where maybe they don't speak English or German. After I pass through the town of Silmenitz, though, I reach a point where I have to detour away from hiking along the E10. And I think this is probably a good point to talk about one of the questions that was asked in the comments to the previous day's video, since, as you can see, I'm hiking along a bike path and the scenery is kind of monotonous for a while here. I am setting up my overnight on the opposite side of the Schoritzer Wiek at a small campground that is is on the boundary of a nature preserve. A large section of the Schoritzer Wiek is a biosphere reserve, and the campground is on the opposite end of it. There's no way to reach it except by circling around the bay, so that's what I'm doing right now. I've turned off of the E10 and I'm heading southward along this bike path. But the question of where to set up your camp along these trails, I think that's a thing that's probably worth discussing, because it turns out, as I am planning my hikes, to be the most complicated and difficult part of the logistics of planning them. My campgrounds are only at certain points. I'm going to show you the map of my planned route here, and I'll mark the places where I was staying at normal campgrounds. You'll see there aren't really that many of them, and they are not very close to one another. And so, as you can probably surmise from the previous two videos, I've had to take overnights in a few places that are a little uncommon. I was staying for 2 nights on farms. One, I happened to get lucky, and the proprietor had a little space that he had set up specifically for people to camp. But my previous night in the orchard at Altkamp, I didn't really have anywhere to set up my tent except in this nice grassy parking area that was next to the storage barn. When you are planning one of these hikes, where you can set up a tent ends up having ripple effects for all of your day hikes and all of the sections you're doing. For example, I had a really easy first overnight at a campground at Juliusruhe and another fairly convenient one at Litzo, but figuring out where I was going to put my overnights for the next 2 nights ended up affecting all the rest of the trip. And one of the decisions I made is that I wanted to spend the next night at a normal campground. There's a really nice campground on the opposite side of the bay. As I said, they have washing facilities and a laundry, so I could wash my clothes, and they had a bunch of other amenities that were really convenient, and I wanted to do that at least for one more night before I continued on for the rest of the hike, and that affected where I could camp the next night. That's turning into one of the issues I'm confronting as I'm following the E10 south of Berlin as well. Where I can find an overnight determines how long each of the day's segments is going to be. And it ends up being the case that some days, for example here as well, I'm only able to hike maybe 10 kilometers because the alternative is that I would have to hike maybe 30 or 40 to the next overnight. So I have to squeeze some overnight in between along the way. But as I've been talking here about camping, I've made my way around the bay and am now hiking through the nature preserve on the opposite side. And this is one of my favorite parts of this entire hike. It was a fairly isolated forest. It's on the edge of a promontory that you can only really get to by hiking along or driving along that one road. And once you get here, there's very little in the way of civilization or traffic. I passed through a few small villages. On the way, I kept passing by the same bakery delivery truck who was making his rounds to all the small settlements to deliver bread and baked goods. But once I get to the end of this road, I enter into the nature preserve, and as you can see, I'm just hiking along a grassy path on the edge of a marshland and eventually along the coast. And it's truly a beautiful space. I really enjoyed this last little bit of hike. By this point, I think I've covered about 22, 23 kilometers from the previous night at Altkamp, so I'm fairly tired. And by the time I get to this, I'm really grateful to be in such a lovely environment. I'll stop a couple times as I make my way over these last couple kilometers just to look out on the water and look at the flocks of birds taking flight or watch some swans passing by. I think there was even a small herd of cows at one point along the way here. I'm not sure how they got there. Maybe this part of it has a farm as well. But in general, it's such a lovely experience, and it was such a welcome change. I have to admit, sometimes hiking along a road or hiking through towns doesn't really feel so much like a wilderness hiking experience. And being able to wrap up the day with something like this really capped it off nicely. When I was editing the video for this day's segment as well, I wanted to leave as much space as I could to show the footage from this nature preserve, just because it was so nice to see and to hike through it and to experience it. I really enjoyed it. It does get a little rough along the way. You'll see here I'm starting to hold up my trekking poles because I keep catching them on the grass. It's rather tall, and at a couple points I have to push through some thickets and brambles and bushes and things. It's a little bit of rough going, but of course I don't mind. As I'm coming up on the camp here at Putzwald, I think was the name of it, I probably should spend some time here since I think I'm going to be getting this video out just before the new year. I want to give a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be doing in the next year. I have obviously one more day for this hike that I'm going to be wrapping up, but after that I am going to be doing a few more long distance hikes. I'm going to be getting myself ready for something in March. I'm hoping to hike across the Austrian section of the E10 over a couple weeks. We'll see how that goes. Going forward, I should probably also point out, as I think I already mentioned in one of the earlier videos, I have a camera that has a working microphone that I'm using on the rest of these hikes. So when I do those, there's going to be quite a bit less talking and a lot more of the sounds of the environment I'm in, which I'm looking forward to. It's going to be nice. I'm working on turning this project into something a little bit larger. I'll talk about that more in the next video, but as part of that, just to make something of a plug for my own work, I've now set up a couple other social media websites to support my work and share material that I gather from my various hikes. Their links are down in the description. The one I should probably mention above the rest is that I set up a Patreon. If you enjoy the work I do and would like to support it directly without subscribing to my Substack blog to read articles and essays that I write, that would be the most effective way to support it directly. And the money I raise through that not only would go to fund my own hiking, but would also go to organizations that are supporting these trails. But like I said, I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video. While I'm hiking across the last section of this trail toward the city of Stralsund, I'm on a bridge for about 4 kilometers and I have time to reflect. So I will bring all that up in the next video. For now, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this section of the trail, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again for watching, and have a happy new year.